The history of the United States and the United Kingdom includes the acquisition of territories and the subsequent granting of citizenship to their inhabitants through single legislative acts, a practice that raises significant concerns about its logic and implications. This approach, starkly contrasting with the scrutinized individual immigration and naturalization processes, allows entire populations to gain citizenship and unrestricted migration rights without vetting, inviting potential security risks and cultural discord. Drawing on historical records which highlight immigration scams and systemic issues, this report examines the absurdity of this policy, detailing instances where the US and UK extended citizenship, the motivations behind these decisions, often tied to war, labor needs, or administrative control, and the problems arising from unvetted mass migration. The core issue lies in the reckless decision to grant citizenship to large groups without individual checks, a practice that defies rational governance. Individual immigration involves vetting for criminality or health, yet it is plagued by scams, including fake documents and fraudulent applications. In contrast, mass citizenship grants, such as the Jones-Shafferth Act for Puerto Ricans or the British Nationality Act for Caribbean residents, bypass this scrutiny, risking the entry of criminals or culturally incompatible groups. This unrestricted migration alters neighborhoods, introducing unfamiliar traditions and straining resources, a concern amplified by modern globalist policies and government-funded NGOs facilitating movement. The lack of vetting exacerbates issues like overcrowded cities and social adjustments, compounded by the absence of a process to assess compatibility or security threats, making the policy appear increasingly absurd in the context of national stability. Motivations for these acts often reflect strategic miscalculations or economic priorities. War has been a frequent justification, with citizenship granted to support military drafts or governance needs, as seen in historical expansions. The pursuit of labor, particularly cheap and unskilled workers, has also driven these decisions, with colonial populations recruited to fill cheap workforce gaps rather than for skilled contributions. Administrative control over territories has further prompted these grants, aiming to solidify political authority. The lack of vetting amplifies problems. Overcrowded urban areas, cultural clashes, and potential security risks, exacerbated by globalist influences and NGOs supporting modern migration flows. This approach, rooted in historical expediency, invites discord and highlights the folly of bypassing individual scrutiny. Comprehensive chronology of US and UK territorial acquisitions and citizenship grants. The following section presents an expanded and comprehensive timeline of US and UK territorial acquisitions and citizenship grants, ordered by date from the earliest event in 1607 to the latest in 1997. Each entry includes the initial acquisition date with a reference to the citizenship grant date, the citizenship grant date with a reference to the acquisition date, and all other significant dates, ensuring a thorough sequence of territorial control, legal evolution, and migration impacts. 1607, Jamestown Settlement. Early British colonial context. The UK began colonial expansion with Jamestown, Virginia, on May 14, 1607, marking the start of influence that later extended to Caribbean territories, serving as a foundational event for British colonial policy. 1655, British takeover of Jamaica. The UK seized Jamaica on May 10, 1655, initiating Caribbean colonization, establishing a foundation for later governance, with citizenship granted on July 1, 1948, associated with this acquisition. 1814, British acquisition of Malta. The UK took control of Malta on March 30, 1814, after the Napoleonic Wars, securing a strategic Mediterranean outpost, with citizenship granted on July 1, 1948, connected to this acquisition. 1842, British acquisition of Hong Kong. The UK gained Hong Kong on August 29, 1842, after the First Opium War, establishing a trading hub, with selective citizenship offered on July 4, 1990, linked to this acquisition and the 1997 handover. 1878, British acquisition of Cyprus. Acquired via the Cyprus Convention on June 4, 1878, with the Ottoman Empire, securing a strategic position, with citizenship granted on July 1, 1948, related to this acquisition. 1898, U.S. acquisition of Hawaii. Annexed via the Newlands Resolution on July 7, 1898, after the Spanish-American War, incorporating the islands, with citizenship granted on April 30, 1900, tied to this acquisition. 1898, U.S. acquisition of Guam. taken during the Spanish-American War on June 20, 1898, establishing U.S. control, with citizenship granted on August 1, 1950, connected to this acquisition. Our 1898, U.S. acquisition of Puerto Rico, acquired via the Treaty of Paris on December 10, 1898, after the Spanish-American War, adding the territory, with citizenship granted on March 2, 1917, associated with this acquisition. A 1900 U.S. acquisition of American Samoa, secured via the Tripartite Convention on June 7, 1900, establishing U.S. oversight, with residents remaining U.S. nationals since October 17, 1960, linked to this acquisition. A 1917 U.S. purchase of U.S. Virgin Islands, bought from Denmark on January 17, 1917, transferring control, with citizenship granted on March 3, 1927, related to this purchase. A 1917 Jones-Shafrath Act, Puerto Rico citizenship was granted on March 2, 1917, through the Jones-Shafrath Act, linked to the 1898 acquisition of Puerto Rico for war support and control, with migration starting at about 700,000 by 1957. A 1927 Naval Appropriation Act, U.S. Virgin Islands citizenship was granted on March 3, 1927, via the Naval Appropriation Act, tied to the 1917 purchase of the U.S. Virgin Islands for territorial management, with about 30,000 migrating by 1960. A 1948 British Nationality Act, Jamestown and Caribbean citizenship was granted on July 1, 1948, via the British Nationality Act, connected to the 1607 Jamestown Settlement and 1655 Jamaica Acquisition, unifying colonial subjects post-World War II, with the Windrush arrival on June 22, 1948. Initiating migration. A 1948 British Nationality Act, Jamaica citizenship was granted on July 1, 1948, under the British Nationality Act, associated with the 1655 acquisition of Jamaica and 1607 Jamestown context, aimed at post-war labor needs, with migration peaking by the 1970s and about 500,000 to 700,000 moving. A 1948 British Nationality Act, Malta citizenship was granted on July 1, 1948, via the British Nationality Act, related to the 1814 acquisition of Malta, supporting governance and migration, with about 50,000 moving by 1960. A 1948 British Nationality Act, Cyprus citizenship was granted on July 1, 1948, under the British Nationality Act, linked to the 1878 acquisition of Cyprus, for administrative integration, with about 40,000 migrating by 1960. A 1950 Organic Act of Guam citizenship was granted on August 1, 1950, under the Organic Act of Guam, tied to the 1898 acquisition of Guam, to enhance military and civil governance, with about 20,000 moving by 1970. A 1960 American Samoa Constitution, American Samoa status residents remain U.S. nationals since October 17, 1960, associated with the 1900 acquisition of American Samoa, with about 10,000 migrating by 1970, reflecting limited citizenship status. A 1990 British Nationality Act, Hong Kong selective citizenship was offered on July 4, 1990, through the British Nationality Act, connected to the 1842 acquisition of Hong Kong and 1997 handover on July 1, 1997, to manage the transition, with 50,000 passports issued. A 1997 handover of Hong Kong. The UK returned Hong Kong to China on July 1, 1997, a significant event linked to the 1842 acquisition and 1990 Citizenship Act, concluding British control. Restrictions post-citizenship are minimal. Puerto Ricans face no migration limits but lack congressional votes, while Windrush migrants had residency rights until the 1971 Immigration Act restricted new arrivals. Hawaii, Guam, and U.S. Virgin Islanders migrate freely with constraints, and the UK's selective Hong Kong policy limited passports, but Caribbean migration was initially open. This lack of oversight defies logic, inviting discord and highlighting the folly of such governance. Post-citizenship rights and restrictions in U.S. and UK territories. The United States and United Kingdom have established specific rights and restrictions for inhabitants of territories like Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Jamaica, Malta, Cyprus, and Hong Kong after granting citizenship through legislative acts. These vary by territory, influenced by legal frameworks and historical context. This section examines post-citizenship restrictions, focusing on voting rights, migration constraints, and other limitations, based on historical records, including the 1971 Immigration Act's impact on Caribbean migration and the selective Hong Kong policy. Puerto Ricans, granted citizenship in 1917 under the Jones-Shafrath Act, lack voting rights in U.S. presidential or full congressional elections while in Puerto Rico, electing a non-voting resident commissioner. They face no migration restrictions to the mainland, though economic factors limit movement, and are exempt from federal income tax on island earnings but subject to federal laws and military drafts, with incomplete constitutional protections due to territorial status. Windrush migrants, given citizen of the UK and colony status in 1948 under the British Nationality Act, had voting rights in UK elections with residency and enjoyed unrestricted residency and work rights. The late 2010s Windrush scandal saw some lose rights due to documentation issues, with no initial migration limits altered by later policies. The Immigration Act of 1971, effective 1973, restricted new Caribbean arrivals by limiting entry to those with British ancestry or work permits, ending automatic CUKC settlement rights and reducing migration. Hawaiians, with citizenship in 1900 and statehood in 1959, have full U.S. voting rights and migration freedom. Guam and U.S. Virgin Islanders, granted citizenship in 1950 and 1927 respectively, can migrate freely but lack federal voting rights, electing non-voting delegates, and face limited federal assistance despite paying taxes. The 1990 British Nationality Act offered 50,000 selective passports to Hong Kong residents before the 1997 handover, restricting citizenship and migration to specific criteria. Caribbean migration to the UK was unrestricted post-1948 until the 1962 and 1968 Acts introduced permits and ancestry rules, with the 1971 Act further limiting new arrivals. Additional restrictions vary across territories, reflecting diverse post-citizenship experiences. Puerto Rico has limited self-governance, restricting local control. Hawaii enjoys full U.S. state rights, including voting. Guam and the U.S. Virgin Islands face territorial constraints, lacking federal voting and full representation despite taxes. Jamaica's rights, strong in 1948, eroded post-1971 with the Immigration Act, affecting some via the Windrush scandal. Malta had full UK rights until 1964 independence, then limited new entries. Cyprus' 1948 rights were restricted by 1971 for new migrants. Hong Kong's 1990 citizenship ended with the 1997 handover. These variations highlight the complex legal landscape of citizenship across these regions. Conclusion. The United States and the United Kingdom's territorial acquisitions, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Guam, U.S. Virgin Islands, Jamaica, Malta, Cyprus, and Hong Kong, followed by mass citizenship grants, reflect a series of strategic blunders, war-driven necessities, and labor demands that facilitated unchecked and unvetted migration. This reckless policy, starkly at odds with the flawed yet scrutinized processes of individual immigration, has fueled cultural tensions, governance challenges, and potential security risks across both nations. A comprehensive re-evaluation of laws such as the Jones-Shafrath Act and the British Nationality Act is imperative, requiring a historical perspective on the citizenship rights of existing citizens before granting such rights to these large, unvetted groups. This reassessment should consider the fraudulent and destructive nature of these acts, crafted by clueless and corrupt politicians for questionable reasons that served no significant purpose for the original citizenry, such as unnecessary wars or the exploitation of cheap labor. The citizenship status of these mass-granted groups, along with their descendants who migrated unchecked, can be reinterpreted and potentially altered or reversed through this re-evaluation, addressing the lack of vetting and the use of fraud or criminal collusion that allowed their entry. Such a review might involve new legislation to establish vetting protocols, ensuring national security and mitigating cultural disruptions, while balancing the rights of current citizens against the influx of newcomers. This process could also hold legislators and special interest groups accountable for the criminal implications of these policies, reducing societal strain and restoring a rational approach to immigration governance. By revisiting these historical decisions, both nations can safeguard their legal integrity and address the long-term consequences of these ill-conceived acts, offering a pathway to rectify the unchecked migration that has reshaped their demographics and social fabric.